The water tower was the first thing that told me something was wrong, because it was overflowing. I'd driven past that tower maybe 200 times in 8 months, out on Route 491 where the high desert flattens into nothing but sage and red dirt and the long blue shadow of the mesas. It was a standard elevated tank, 80,000 gallons, riveted steel on 4 legs, painted a faded municipal silver that had gone chalky in the sun, serving a cluster of homes and a small school on the western edge of the Navajo Nation. My company had the contract to assess and upgrade water infrastructure out there, and that tower was one of mine. I knew its float valve. I knew its pressure curve. I knew the exact pitch of the wind through its support struts on a gusty afternoon. And I knew it should never, ever be spilling water down its own legs in a place where every drop is hauled or pumped or prayed for. It was 6:40 in the morning. The sky was that bruised gray it gets before the sun clears the rim. The kind of light that flattens everything and steals the color out of the land so the whole world looks like an old photograph somebody left out in the rain. And the overflow was running steady. A silver sheet pouring off the catwalk lip and braiding down the nearest leg, turning the dust below to a spreading patch of red mud. And there was nobody around to care. No trucks. No kids waiting for the bus that should have been idling by the school gate with its diesel cough and its yellow lights blinking. Just the sound of water hitting dirt. A soft, endless hiss. And underneath it, very faint, a car alarm somewhere far off to the south. Going and going and going, with no one to shut it off. I sat in my truck on the shoulder for a moment with the heater ticking and watched it. And I felt the first small cold finger touch the back of my neck. Not fear, not yet. Just wrongness. The kind a man feels when he walks into his own house and something has been moved an inch from where it lives. I want to take 10 seconds before this goes any further. Thank you to everyone who keeps coming back for these. And if you're new here, welcome. Pull up a chair. If grounded survival stories are your thing, stay with the channel. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Now let me get back to that morning, because that overflowing tower was the smallest wrong thing I'd see all day. My name is Halford Crane. Most people just called me Hal. I was 48 that spring, a civil engineer out of Albuquerque, divorced for 6 years, with a daughter named Wren at college in Flagstaff, who texted me memes I didn't understand, and called me on Sundays when she remembered. I'd spent 26 years building and fixing the unglamorous bones of the world. Culverts, lift stations, pressure-reducing valves, manhole inverts and force mains, and the kind of buried concrete nobody ever sees and everybody depends on. The things nobody thinks about until the day they stop working. And then the whole town suddenly remembers that water doesn't actually come from the faucet, that it comes from a machine somebody built and somebody maintains, and that the somebody is usually a tired man in a reflective vest with mud to his knees. I was good at it. I'll say that plainly because it's going to matter later. I could read a system the way some people read a face. I could stand in front of a pump house and tell you what was about to fail just from the sound it made. The faint knock of a worn bearing, the wrong hum of a motor pulling too many amps. And from the smell of the air, the hot penny smell of an electrical fault or the rotten egg whisper of a seal gone bad. That skill kept me employed, and it kept me calm in situations that scared younger men. The ones who panicked when an alarm went off and froze when a number went red. I'd talk them down. I'd say, the system is telling you something. All you have to do is listen. But that skill also gave me a blind spot, and I didn't learn what that blind spot was until it nearly killed me. I trusted systems. I believed that if you understood how a thing was built, you could predict how it would break. And if you could predict the break, you could stay ahead of it. People, weather, Fear those I treated like variables to be managed around the real work. Like noise you filtered out so you could hear the signal. That was the mistake. The people who did this to that land understood my kind of man better than I understood myself. I'll get to it. That morning, I was supposed to meet a crew at a booster station about 12 miles north, near a wide spot in the road in Tunanese-Desi country. Though the station itself sat off reservation on a parcel the Water Authority had leased decades back, I'd stayed the night in a motel in a border town because the drive from Gallup was too long to do twice in a day on the schedule we were keeping. I remember the room smelled like cigarettes that had soaked into the curtains over 20 years and lemon cleaner laid down over the top of it. And the bedspread had that scratchy polyester nap that never feels clean no matter what. The TV had been showing the same loop of local news when I went to sleep, a car wreck on the interstate. A high school basketball score, a weather map promising wind out of the southwest and a slim chance of rain. Ordinary, the small, reassuring drone of a place where nothing was happening. When I woke up, the TV was showing color bars, not a channel that had signed off for the night and would come back. The actual emergency test pattern, frozen, those vertical stripes of color with the black box at the bottom, and no tone, no sound at all. I'd thought nothing of it. Cheap motel, bad cable, a signal that had drifted in the night. I'd showered in water that came out of the tap a little cloudy, which I'd noticed and dismissed, because well water and old pipes out here often run cloudy and it clears if you let it sit. I'd shaved. I'd loaded my truck in the dark with the gear I always carried, my soft-sided tool bag and my hard hat and my laptop case and a thermos. And I'd pulled out before the front desk was even staffed, leaving my key card on the empty counter next to a coffee pot that had burned dry, the carafe gone brown and scorched, a smell I noticed and didn't think about. Somebody had left it on all night. People do that. I told myself people do that. So when I saw that tower overflowing, my first thought was an outbreak. The word didn't exist in my head yet. My first thought, the trained thought, the comfortable thought was, the SCADA telemetry's down, and the pumps are running blind. That's a real failure mode. SCADA is the control system, the supervisory layer, the thing that's supposed to watch the tank level and tell the pumps when to start and stop. The float in the tank reports the level. The level gets sent back to the controller decides. When that communication drops, the pumps don't know the tank is full. And depending on how the logic is configured, the default behavior is often to keep pumping, and you get exactly what I was looking at. Water over the top, down the legs, into the dust. It's the kind of thing that happens when a relay fries, or a phone line gets cut, or a lightning strike takes out a radio link. Boring, fixable. The kind of problem I exist to solve. The kind I could fix in an afternoon and write up in a report and bill for. I pulled fully onto the shoulder, set the brake, and called the Water Authority's operations line. I had it memorized. It rang 4 times, that long electronic burr, and went to a voicemail that announced it was full and could not take messages, and hung up on me. I frowned at the phone. The ops line voicemail was never full. I tried the after-hours emergency cell for the regional supervisor, a man named Dolph Rayburn, who'd been doing this job longer than I'd been alive. A heavy-set, slow-talking man with reading glasses he kept pushed up on his forehead and a habit of calling everyone chief. It rang once and died. Not voicemail, not a busy tone, just dead, mid-ring, the connection dropping like someone had reached over and pressed the end button. I sat there a minute with the engine running and the heater going, watching the water come down, turning the phone over in my hand. The car alarm in the distance had stopped at some point while I wasn't paying attention. That should have been a relief, and instead it bothered me, because I realized I'd gotten used to it in just a few minutes. And the silence it left was bigger than I expected. Out here, the silence is never total. There's wind. There's the tick of a cooling engine. There's a dog somewhere working a fence line. A generator running at a chapter house. A far-off semi grinding up a grade on the highway. The distant, single-engine drone of a Cessna doing rounds over the grazing land. That morning, there was none of it. Just my truck and the water and the wide gray sky and the cold. And the cold seemed louder than it should have been. I made a decision that I would second-guess for a long time afterward. I decided to drive to the booster station as planned, because that's where my crew would be, and because the booster station had its own SCADA terminal, a full operator interface. And from there I could see the whole network, every tank and pump and valve laid out on a schematic, and figure out what had failed. I told myself I was being responsible, that the worst thing in a confusing situation is to abandon your post and run around chasing rumors. The truth, the one I can admit now, is that I was running toward the thing I understood because I didn't want to look directly at the things I didn't. The empty road, the dead phones, the dry coffee pot and the frozen screen. I had a place where the answers were supposed to live, and I drove toward it the way a man walks faster past a dark window. The first body was at mile marker 19. It was lying in the southbound lane, half on the center line, and my foot was already on the brake before my brain finished telling me what it was. That reflex you can't override. The one that knows the shape of a human being from a quarter mile off, a man. Older, in a denim jacket gone pale at the seams, face down, one boot off and lying a few feet away on its side like it had been pulled loose. I stopped maybe 40 feet back and sat there with both hands on the wheel, and my heart going hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. I'm not a coward, but I'm not a fool either, and a body in the road is a thing you approach carefully, because it might not be what it looks like. Animals could be working it. It could be bait, somebody lying in wait. It could be a drunk who'll come up swinging and confused. My father, who'd worked highway construction his whole life, had drilled it into me. A man down in the road is never just a man down in the road until you've proven it is. I rolled my window down 2 inches and listened. The cold air came in smelling of dust and, faintly, of something else. Something low and meaty that I didn't let myself name. Nothing moved. I tapped the horn once, a short, polite beep that sounded absurd in all that quiet. Nothing. The man didn't twitch, didn't groan, didn't lift his head. And his stillness had a quality to it I can't fully describe, except to say that living things, even deeply sleeping ones, even the passed-out drunk my father warned me about, hold a kind of tension, a readiness, the body keeping its own watch. He had none of it. He was emptied out. The wind moved the loose flap of his jacket, and that was the only thing about him that moved. And it moved the way a rag moves. With nothing underneath it, I got out. I left the door open and the engine running, which is something my father taught me when I was a kid, changing a flat on a mountain road. Never trap yourself. Never put a closed door between you and your only way out. I walked up slow, gravel grinding under my boots, watching the ditches on both sides where a man could hide, watching the open desert beyond. The closer I got, the more the wrong smell grew. Copper and spoilage. And when I got close enough, I could see the dark stain spread out under him on the asphalt. Wide, already gone tacky and dull in the cold morning air, not pooling anymore. His throat. Something had opened his throat. And it wasn't a clean cut. It wasn't a knife or even broken glass. It was torn, ragged, the edges of it pulled and worried. The kind of wound you'd expect from a dog or a coyote working at something. Except no coyote drags a grown man into the middle of a state highway and leaves him there in the open with one boot off and will lure the rest of him untouched. Coyotes feed and scatter. This was something else. This had stopped part way, like it had been interrupted, or like the point of it had never been to feed at all. I want to be honest about what I felt, because the story doesn't work if I pretend I was brave. I felt my stomach turn over hard and a thin sweat come up on me, despite the cold. And I felt 26 years of being the calm one in the room evaporate in about 4 seconds. I backed away from him with my hands half raised like he might suddenly move, walking backward, not turning my back on him. And I got in my truck and I locked the doors, which was absurd, locking a door against a dead man. And I sat there, breathing through my mouth so I wouldn't smell it anymore, and waiting for my hands to stop shaking enough to hold the wheel. Then I did the engineer thing, because it's the only thing I know how to do when the ground goes out from under me. I started looking for the system behind the symptom. One body could be 100 ugly, ordinary things. A hit and run, a robbery gone bad, a dog pack, a man who'd had a stroke and fallen and then been found by something hungry. But one body plus an overflowing tower, plus dead phones, plus a full ops voicemail, plus a frozen emergency broadcast, plus a burned dry coffee pot, plus empty roads at 7 in the morning. That was a pattern. And patterns have causes. A symptom is random. A pattern is designed or driven by something underneath. I pulled out my phone and tried to load any news at all, any page, any app. The bars were there, 3 of them, steady, but every page spun and timed out. The network was up and the internet behind it was gone, which is a very specific kind of broken. And it bothered me the way the overflowing tower bothered me, because it didn't match any natural failure. When the power goes, the towers go too, and you get no bars. When a backhoe cuts a fiber line, a region goes dark all at once. But the cell towers were still powered, still broadcasting, still holding my phone in a handshake. Whatever they were supposed to connect to upstream simply wasn't answering. The local nervous system was alive, and the brain was gone. I drove around the body. I'm not proud of how I did it. Hugging the far shoulder with my eyes locked forward and my jaw set so hard it ached afterward. The tires crunching off the pavement into the gravel and back. But I did it. And I kept going north. Because going back meant going back into a town where that frozen TV and that empty front desk and that scorched coffee pot now meant something they hadn't an hour before. And forward was where my map was. The booster station sat behind a chain-link fence at the end of a quarter-mile gravel spur, a low concrete block building the color of the dirt around it, with 2 big vertical pump motors inside, a bank of pressure tanks, and a steel mast 40 feet tall holding the radio whip and the telemetry antenna and a small solar panel for the backup logic. I'd driven that spur 100 times. My crew's trucks weren't there. That was the second gut punch, and it was worse than the first, because the body in the road was a stranger, and the crew were mine. Sela Birdsong and her brother Tobias ran that crew, both of them local, both of them sharp as anyone I'd ever worked with anywhere. Sela especially, who could troubleshoot a control panel faster than men with twice her schooling. They were never late, ever. Sela treated lateness as a moral failing. The empty yard hit me in the chest. The vehicle gate was chained, but the chain was loose, hanging in a slack loop, and the padlock was open, the shackle sprung, which meant somebody had been here and left, or somebody had been here and not finished leaving. I keyed myself in through the man gate beside it, the smaller pedestrian gate, and crossed the gravel yard with my truck keys laced through my fingers so the point stuck out between my knuckles, feeling ridiculous and not caring, my head on a swivel. The building door was unlocked. It shouldn't have been. We kept it locked, even when crews were inside. I pushed it open and stood in the doorway, letting my eyes adjust. Inside, it was dim and cool, and smelled the way pump houses always smell. The way they've smelled my whole career, like wet concrete and warm electric motors and a faint chemical sweetness of chlorine. And that familiar smell was so normal and so safe that it almost undid me, standing there with keys in my fist after seeing a man's torn throat in the road. The pumps were running. I could feel them through the soles of my boots, that deep, even vibration in the slab, the heartbeat of the place. And the SCADA terminal in the corner was alive. Its screen glowing soft blue in the dim, which meant power, and meant the machine was awake, and meant I could finally see. I sat down at that terminal with relief so sharp it was almost painful, the office chair squeaking under me, and put my hands on the keyboard like a man laying his hands on something holy. This was my territory. This was a problem with inputs and outputs, with logic and data, with green and yellow and red. I knew this interface better than I knew the kitchen of my own apartment. I pulled up the network overview, the schematic map of every asset in the district, each one a little icon arranged on a stylized map. Each tank, each pump station, each pressure-reducing valve, each remote terminal unit out in the field. Every icon should glow green for nominal or yellow for a warning worth checking, or red for a fault or a loss of communication. Almost everything was red. Not scattered red. Not the random red of equipment that fails one piece at a time, the way equipment does. This was red, that it spread. I pulled up the event log, the system's own diary, every status change written in the cold, patient language of timestamps, and I scrolled back through the night, and I felt the hair come up on my arms. The communication failures had started just after 1 a.m. and cascaded outward, asset by asset, station by station, in a wave. And the wave had a direction. It had started in the population centers, the chapter houses, and the schools, and the clinic, and rolled outward toward the edges, toward the empty land, tower by tower, like lights going out in a city seen from a plane at night, one neighborhood at a time, blinking dark. The booster station I was sitting in, out near the edge, had gone isolated at 4:52 a.m. It was still pumping because it was still receiving its own local command from its own local logic, the dumb loyal program in the box on the wall, but it was deaf to everything beyond its fence. An island in a dead sea. And then I found the thing that took the whole morning apart and rebuilt it into something I couldn't have imagined. The thing that told me this wasn't an infrastructure failure at all, but something using the infrastructure as a stage. At 3:18 in the morning, hours before the communication wave reached this station, the SCADA system had logged a manual override command on the chemical dosing pumps at the main treatment plant 40 miles south. The dosing pumps are the ones that meter chemicals into the water chlorine for disinfection, and the others, the pH adjusters, the corrosion inhibitors, the whole careful recipe that makes water safe to drink. Someone had logged into the control system with valid credentials, a real account, a real password, and changed the dosing set points, not turned them off. That would have been sabotage, crude and obvious, a denial of treatment. This was worse, because it was precise. They'd changed the values, set them to numbers that made no sense at all, for treating water and a great deal of sense if you wanted to push something specific, some additional agent, into 80 miles of distribution pipe in a single controlled dose before the network fell silent and nobody could see what had been done. The login belonged to Dolph Rayburn, the man whose phone had rung once and died. I sat in that cold, concrete room with the pumps humming under my feet and the blue light on my face, and felt the floor drop out of everything I thought I understood about the morning. I'd been treating this whole thing like a machine that had broken, looking for the failed relay, the cut line, the natural cause. Machines don't log in at 3 in the morning and reprogram their own poison. People do. A person had sat at a keyboard like the one under my hands and typed numbers and pressed enter. And the water I'd showered in cloudy that morning. The water in that overflowing tower spilling into the dust. The water in every house and school and clinic and stock tank across an area the size of a small state had been touched by someone's deliberate hands hours before anyone knew to be afraid of their own faucet. I didn't know yet what had been put in the water. I didn't know if it was the cause of the man in the road or just one more symptom, one more thread in a thing I couldn't yet see the shape of. But I knew two things with total, cold certainty. The first was that I needed to stop assuming I understood the system, because the system had been turned, deliberately and skillfully, against the people it existed to serve. And every assumption I made from my old, comfortable trust was going to be wrong. The second was that I'd made coffee at the motel with that water and drunk 3 cups of it before I left, sitting on the scratchy bedspread watching frozen color bars. And if whatever Rayburn had done was in it, then I was already, in some way I couldn't measure, part of the problem I was trying to solve. I want to know what you'd have done right then, driven south toward the plant to find answers, or north toward the edge of it all, and kept driving until you were out. Tell me in the comments, because I'm still not sure I chose right. Here's what happened. I checked myself first. That's the brutal practicality of being scared and trained at the same time, the two halves of you working in the same body, one screaming and one taking notes. I sat in the squeaking chair and took my own pulse against my wrist, counted it, fast but steady. I looked at my hands held out flat for tremor, and they shook, but with fear, the ordinary kind, the kind I understood. I pressed the back of my hand to my own neck to check for fever, which is nearly useless when both hand and neck are yours. But it felt like doing something. And doing something is how I keep from drowning. I felt fine. I felt the kind of fine that doesn't reassure you, because I had no idea what the incubation period was for a thing I couldn't name. No idea whether fine was a baseline or a countdown. But I wasn't tearing out anyone's throat in the middle of a road. And that was the bar I'd set for the morning, low as it was, so I took it and held it. Then I tried the radio. The station had a VHF base unit mounted on the wall, a good commercial set we used for talking to crews out in the dead zones where cell coverage gave out, which was most of the district. I'd used it dozens of times to raise Sela when she was down in a vault somewhere with no signal. I keyed up on the work channel, pressed the bar on the side of the handset, and called for Sela, for Tobias, for anyone, my voice sounding strange and loud in the concrete room. Static answered. The soft, directionless hiss of an open channel with nobody on it. I worked through the channels we used, all of them. Then I switched the set to scan and let it walk the public bands, watching the frequency numbers tumble. Most of the bands were empty. On the National Weather Service frequency, the automated voice was still going. That flat, computerized drone, reading out a forecast recorded the day before by a machine that didn't know anything had happened. Winds out of the southwest, a slight chance of rain, a hazard statement about blowing dust, and the contrast between that calm, dead machine voice describing an ordinary day and the body lying 40 feet from my truck made my skin crawl worse than any scream could have. It was the sound of the world before, still playing, like a song coming out of a house where everyone had already left. Then, low on a frequency I shouldn't have been getting anything on at all. A band that should have been quiet. I caught a human voice. It came and went, fading up and ducking back down with the wind and the atmosphere the way distant signals do when they're skipping in off the upper air, riding conditions that opened and closed. But I caught pieces, and I leaned in close to the speaker and held my breath to get them. A man, tired, methodical, not panicked. The voice of someone who had decided to be useful, repeating a message on a loop. Any utility or public health personnel. The contamination is in the potable supply. Do not drink. Do not boil. Boiling does not repeat. Does not. And then it slid under the noise, and I lost it. The hiss swallowing it whole. I sat forward and worked the squelch knob with my fingertips, easing it down to let weaker signals through, and waited. And it came back up out of the static, like a swimmer surfacing. The agent is not the infection vector. The agent is the disinhibitor. The bites are the vector. Separate the two in your head, or you will make the wrong choices. And gone again. The agent is not the infection vector. The agent is the disinhibitor. I'm an engineer, not a doctor, but I understood enough. And I sat there with the words turning over in my head until they locked into place. Whatever Rayburn had dosed the water with didn't make people sick the way a germ makes you sick. It wasn't the disease. It did something to behavior. A disinhibitor. It took the brakes off. It reached into whatever part of the brain holds a person back. The part that says don't. The part that feels fear and restraint and second thoughts. And it loosened it. It made people less afraid, more aggressive, more reckless, more willing to cross lines they'd never cross. And the actual contagion, the thing that turned a torn throat into a death and maybe into something worse than death, came from the bite. Two systems, engineered to work together, each useless alone and devastating together. The water didn't need to infect everyone. It just needed to make sure that when the infected started biting, the people they bit wouldn't run, wouldn't fight hard enough, wouldn't have the fear that keeps a person alive. The water primed the field. It turned a whole population into kindling, and the bite was the match. I thought about the man in the road, his torn throat and his one missing boot. The way the boot lay separate as if he'd been moving, struggling, losing his shoes the way you do when something pulls you down. I thought about the school with no bus and the kids who should have been standing at its gate. And I felt the true scale of it settle onto my shoulders, like a load coming down off a crane. This wasn't a town with a problem. This was a designed event, rolled out across an entire region in the dark while people slept. And I had stumbled into the middle of it with a clipboard and a thermos and a set of pump curves. The most ordinary man in the worst place in the country. The voice on the radio came back one more time before the propagation closed up for good, and the band went dead again. If you are receiving this, you are likely outside a dead zone. The agent degrades in sunlight. Repeat, the agent degrades in sunlight. And standing water draws them. Stay away from open water. Stay away from open water. This is... And then it was gone. And I worked the squelch and the dial for 10 more minutes, and it didn't come back. And I sat there in the hum of the pumps, trying to make the pieces fit together into something I could use. The agent degrades in sunlight. Standing water draws them. Stay away from open water. And I was sitting in a building whose entire purpose, whose only reason to exist, was moving water next to pressure tanks and a wet well and pumps pushing thousands of gallons uphill. And 40 miles up the line, there was a tower spilling 80,000 gallons into the dirt at the bottom of its legs. A beacon, a watering hole, in a drought. Drawing them, whatever they were, the way every desert draws everything alive, toward the one place there's water. That's when I heard the gravel crunch in the yard. I killed the SCADA screen with a slap on the monitor's power button out of pure animal instinct, plunging the corner into dimness, and went to the window beside the door, keeping my body to the side of it. A truck had pulled up to the gate. A beat-up white work truck with a utility bed and a faded company logo on the door. And my chest unlocked a notch because I recognized it, Sela's truck. The one with the cracked passenger mirror she kept meaning to replace. Sela birdsong climbed out of the driver's side, and even from across the yard, I could see she was moving wrong. Careful, favoring her left arm, holding it close to her body. And her brother Tobias came out the passenger side and went straight around the bed. And he was helping a third person down, a younger man I didn't know, who couldn't seem to get his feet under him, who sagged and slid against Tobias like his legs had quit. I went to the door and pulled it open and called her name across the yard, and she turned fast at the sound, and the look on her face stopped me cold in the doorway. Relief and terror at the same time, the two of them fighting in her eyes. "Hal," she said, and her voice cracked on the one syllable. "Hal, thank God. Is anyone else here? Is there anybody else?" "Just me," I said. "Sela, what happened? Where's everyone? Where's the rest of the—" "Don't come close yet." She got her good hand up, palm out, and there was real warning in it, and I stopped where I was on the threshold. "Donovan got bit. We're trying, we don't know how long it just stay back a second, Hal, please." The young man, Donovan, sagged harder against Tobias, and I could see him better now in the gray light. He was maybe 23, 24, lean, in a hooded sweatshirt with the sleeve pushed up, and his right forearm was wrapped in a shop rag that had soaked through dark. His skin had gone grayish under the brown, an ashy undertone like cold wood smoke, and his eyes had the wet, glassy shine of a high fever, the look of a man burning up from the inside. Tobias was a big man, 6'3" and broad, gentle as the day is long, a deacon at the little Baptist church in his community who carried hard candy in his pockets for kids. And he was holding the stranger up with both his big arms, and his face was wet with tears he wasn't bothering to wipe, and he wasn't ashamed of any of it. "How long ago?" I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "How long ago did he get bit, Sela?" "Maybe 2 hours," she said. "We were at the plant. We went down to the plant because that's where Dolph said to meet on the call last night, before everything ended." Her voice came apart, and she pressed her lips together and started again. "Hal, it was a slaughter down there. It wasn't Dolph that met us. Dolph wasn't even there with these people. And they didn't act like people, they didn't make any sound. They just came, and Donovan got pulled into it before any of us could even—" "You were at the treatment plant," I said, and something in me went very still and careful. 2 hours ago. Did you see Dolph? Did you actually see him?" She looked at me strange, with a flicker of confusion, because of course, the man who just escaped a massacre would wonder why I was standing in a doorway asking after her supervisor instead of helping with the bleeding kid. But I had the timestamp in my head. 3:18 a.m., the manual override, the changed set points, Rayburn's login, and I needed to know if Rayburn was a victim or the architect of all of it. "We saw what was left of him," Sela said, quiet now, the fight gone out of her voice. "Hal, somebody had locked the dosing room from the inside. The chem room. The door was barricaded from the inside. There was a desk shoved against it, and Dolph was in there. And he'd been in there a long time before they got through to him. There were... She stopped. There were food wrappers, water bottles, like he'd been holed up in there for hours, like he was hiding from what he'd done before they ever showed up. There it was. Rayburn hadn't been a hijacker who'd slipped in and out. He'd been the one who barricaded himself in the dosing room after he changed the set points, which meant one of three things, and I ran through all three standing in that doorway in about 2 seconds. Either he'd been forced to do it at gunpoint and then sealed himself away in horror at what they'd made him do, or he'd done it willingly, for money or out of belief or out of whatever rots a man, and then couldn't live in his own skin afterward. Or, and this was the possibility that put the deepest cold in me, he'd done it because someone had something on him, a leash, and afterward he'd hidden because he knew exactly what he had unleashed and knew it would come for him and everyone else. Any way you cut it, the man who'd poisoned the water of an entire nation had died terrified of his own work, sealed in a room with his snacks and his water bottles waiting for the thing he'd built to find him. And that told me everything I needed to know about the people who'd set him to it. They were not the kind you reason with. They were the kind a careful man hides from. We didn't have time to stand there working it out. Donovan made a sound, a low, wet groan that didn't sound like pain so much as like something pulling loose deep inside him. A structural sound, a load-bearing thing giving way. And his head came up off Tobias's shoulder. And his eyes had changed. Not gone dark, not gone milky white like in the movies. Worse than that. They'd gone clear and focused and wrong. Fixed on the side of Tobias's throat with a flat, patient, total attention that had nothing human behind it at all. The way a hawk watches a field. The disinhibitor and the bite, the two systems, working exactly as designed, the fever burning out the last of the person and the agent in his blood, ensuring nothing held him back. And I watched the precise second the second system finished what the first had started, watched a sick, frightened kid become a mechanism. "Tobias, let him go," I said, fast and low. "Let him go right now and step back. Step back, Tobias." Tobias didn't. He couldn't. You can't simply tell a man to drop a dying boy he's been carrying through hell on his own shoulders. The muscle memory of an hour of mercy doesn't release in a single word. And that hesitation, that one beat of love overriding sense, is exactly the kind of thing the people who designed this whole machine were counting on. The disinhibitor in the water, the bite that gathers, the bitten who walk toward the living, and the living who can't let go. Donovan twisted in Tobias's arms with a strength a feverish dying kid should not have had. A sudden whole-body wrench, and got both hands fisted in Tobias's collar and pulled himself up the big man's chest toward his throat. And Sela screamed her brother's name in a voice I'd never heard out of her. And I did the only thing my body knew how to do, which was grab the long pipe wrench off the workbench by the door. 30 inches of cold steel, and cross that yard faster than a 48-year-old man with bad knees has any business moving, gravel kicking out behind me. I won't dress up what happened next, and I won't drag it out either. I hit Donovan across the shoulders with the flat of the wrench to break his grip, hard, and it staggered him, but it didn't stop him. And when that didn't work, I hit him again. And Tobias finally tore loose and went down on his back in the gravel. And the kid turned on me, with that same flat hawk's attention swung my way. And there was a stretch of maybe 15 seconds that I have never described to anyone and won't describe in full now. Not because I'm protecting you, but because some things don't survive being said out loud. It ended with Donovan on the gravel, and the wrench heavy and wrong in my two hands, and 3 living people standing in a loose circle around a dead one who'd been alive and frightened and somebody's son that same morning, who'd had a name and a soaked shop rag tied by friends who'd tried to save him. Nobody said anything for a long time. The pumps hummed under the slab. The wind moved across the high desert and lifted the dust and laid it down again. The gray sky was starting to take on the first thin gold at its eastern edge. The sun finally coming. And I stood there understanding, all the way down, that the calm, capable man I'd been for 26 years had just become a different kind of man in the space of 15 seconds. And that there was no version of the rest of my life, however long it ran, where that wasn't permanently true. Sela was the one who broke it, and she did it the way good people do, by going hard and practical so she wouldn't have to feel it yet. So the grief would have to wait its turn behind the work. Tobias, look at me. Let me see your neck. Did he break the skin? Did he get the skin? She crossed to her brother where he sat in the gravel and took his big face in her two hands and turned it. I don't think... Tobias was shaking. Hold still. She pulled his collar down and turned his head to the light. I came and looked too, all three of us needing it to be true. The skin of his neck was unbroken. Red, scraped, a fingernail gouge where Donovan had grabbed the collar, but the skin held. The fabric had taken it. He'd been close enough to feel the kid's breath on his throat, and he'd come back across the line clean. And that small mercy, that 1/2 inch of cotton collar, was the only thing holding any of us together in that yard. And we checked it twice more, in better light, because we needed it. We went inside, into the cool and the chlorine smell and the hum. I powered the SCADA screen back up and showed them the network overview, all that red, and the event log, and the 318 override under Rayburn's login. And I told them about the voice on the radio, and the two systems, the water that primes and the bite that spreads, the agent that degrades in sun and the open water that draws them. Sela leaned on the desk with her good arm and read the logs herself, her eyes moving fast. And Tobias sat in the second chair with his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands. And at the end of it, Sela said the thing I'd been circling and not landing on. If the water's the disinhibitor and it degrades in sunlight, she said slowly, working it the way she worked a control panel, tracing the logic to its end. Then anybody who drank it in the last day is carrying a fuse, a lit one. We don't know how long it burns. Including us, Hal. Including you, if you had water at that motel. I made coffee, I said. 3 cups. Then we don't know what any of us is going to do, she said, and she looked at me steady. The longer this goes on, that's the real problem. It's not just out there. She tapped 2 fingers against her own temple, once. It's in here too, sitting and waiting. And we won't feel it turn the lights down. That's the worst part. We won't feel it. We'll just start making worse choices and be completely sure they're good ones. That landed harder than the body in the yard, harder than anything I'd seen all morning. Because she was right, and because it explained things I didn't want explained. It explained Tobias's fatal hesitation with the kid. It explained my own willingness to drive north past a corpse rather than turn around and run. My strange, calm certainty that pressing on was responsible when a clearer man might have called it what it was. Denial. The water didn't make you a monster. The bite did that. The water just shaved the edges off your judgment, made you a little more reckless, a little more sure of yourself, a little slower to feel the fear that keeps you alive. And the cruelest part of the whole design was that you couldn't measure it from inside your own head. Your judgment was the instrument, and the instrument was the thing being bent. You could only watch each other and hope to catch the dial moving in someone before it moved too far, and trust them to do the same for you. I'm going to ask you something here, and I mean it sincerely, because we had to live the answer, If you knew that something in your own blood was quietly making your decisions worse, hour by hour, and you could not feel it happening, not even a little would you trust yourself. Or would you hand the hard choices to the person standing next to you? Sit with that one. It's not as easy as it sounds. We made a plan, the four of us, which was three of us, plus the weight of the boy on the gravel that none of us would name out loud. The plan was built on the few things I actually knew, because for all my failures of nerve that morning, the infrastructure was still the one map. I could read better than anyone alive on that land. The agent degraded in sunlight, the infected were drawn to open water. And the entire region's water network was, at that exact moment, a constellation of beacons calling them in from every direction. Nuts, towers overflowing, mains broken where panicked people or the infected themselves had torn into them, the treatment plants open clarifier basins sitting 40 miles south under the rising sun like a banquet laid out. "We can use that," I said. And I felt the first thing all morning that wasn't pure reaction, the first cold, clear, forward thought. If they move toward water, then water is how we route them. And if the agent breaks down in sun, then time and daylight are on the side of anybody who can just stay alive long enough for it to clear. Tobias lifted his head out of his hands. His voice was wrecked, low and rough. "Route them where, Hal? We're three people. We can't hurt anything." "Not them," I said. "Us. We route ourselves away from every open water source on the whole network. And we go to the one place in this entire district that has no open water and gets full sun all day long." I pulled up the schematic and I zoomed and put my finger on a point at the top of the highest contour lines on the map. "The Mesa Verde tank, the new one. We finished it in the fall, you and me both, Sela, you remember. It's a fully enclosed welded steel reservoir. No open surface, no overflow yet, because we never commissioned the float and inlet controls. Sitting on top of the highest ground for 30 miles in any direction, with a service road that switchbacks up the south face, and only the three of us and a handful of people at the authority even know is there. One road in, gated at the bottom. No open water for 2 miles in any direction." Sela looked at the screen, then at me, and I watched her run the same arithmetic I'd run, her eyes narrowing. "And it's defensible," she said. "One road in, high ground. You can see anything coming for miles up there. You could see them coming from the bottom of the mesa." "And there's a caretaker's shed," I said. "Cinder block, with a generator and the well, and that's the part that matters most. The well pumps into a sealed pressure tank, not an open one. Enclosed water. And that well predates the whole treatment system by decades. It draws straight from the deep aquifer. It never touched the plant, never touched Rayburn's dosing, never had a drop of the agent in it. We could drink from it and not be putting any more fuses into ourselves. That last part was what truly sold it. More than the high ground, more than the one road. Clean water. Water that hadn't been touched by Rayburn's hands at 3 a.m, or by whatever made Rayburn barricade himself in a room with snacks to wait for his own death. Water that wouldn't keep turning our own judgment against us, hour after hour. Because if the disinhibitor degraded over time, and we stopped taking any more in, then every hour up there in clean water and full sun was an hour our own minds got a fraction more trustworthy, an hour the fuse burned down a little more without anyone lighting a new one. The tank on the mesa wasn't just a fort. It was a way to stop being part of the thing we were running from, a way to get our own selves back. We loaded both trucks fast and efficiently, the way crews load when there's weather coming. No wasted motion. We took what the station had that mattered. The VHF base unit came off the wall. I disconnected it carefully, coiling the antenna lead, because I knew I could rewire it to run off a truck battery or the shed's generator. A coil of antenna wire, the spare whip, the connectors, and the small tool kit I'd need to build out range from up high. Hand tools, the first aid kit off the wall, a real one, trauma supplies and all. Every sealed bottle of water in the place, 2 flats of it, which we wouldn't drink unless we had to but couldn't leave. A 5-gallon jerry can of diesel for the generator. Sela had a bolt-action hunting rifle behind the seat of her truck, a .30-06 she used for deer, and most of a box of shells. Tobias had his own deer rifle racked behind his seat. And I had a pipe wrench I could not make myself set down, which the other 2 were kind enough not to mention, not then and not ever. Before we pulled out, I did one more thing, and it was either the smartest decision I made that whole day or the worst, and I have honestly never been able to decide which. I went back to the SCADA terminal. The system was deaf to the field units that had gone red in the night, that was true. But the ones still showing green, the assets close enough to this isolated island station to still hear its commands, those I could still reach. I, Halford Crane, sitting in a concrete box cut off from the world, still had live write access to a network of pumps and valves spanning 80 miles of high desert. And it hit me that this was a tool, the only real tool I had, and that I'd nearly walked away from it. First, I shut off the booster pumps under our feet so the station would stop pushing water uphill toward that overflowing tower, stop feeding the beacon. And then I did the thing that still wakes me up some nights. I opened every drain valve I had command of on the eastern half of the network, the half of the district away from the Mesa, the empty Arroyo country to the east. I started bleeding the whole eastern pressure zone, down toward the low ground far out east, into the washes, away from us. Because if the infected were drawn to open water, then I would make the single biggest, loudest, most irresistible open water source in the entire district appear in the east, in the emptiest part of the land, and let the network's own stored pressure do the calling for me, drain itself out across the desert, and shine in the sun, and pull every one of those things in that direction. I was using the infrastructure as bait. I was turning the thing I'd spent 8 months protecting and improving into a lure, to drag a region's worth of nightmares away from the road we needed to take north. It felt, in one way, like a betrayal of the entire work, of every careful thing I'd ever signed my name to. And it felt, in another way, like the first genuinely good piece of engineering I'd done all day. Because for the first time, I wasn't trusting the system blindly the way I always had. I was using it deliberately, with both eyes open about what it could do. Sela watched me do it over my shoulder, and she understood instantly, the way she always understood. "You're draining east," she said. "I'm draining east." She was quiet a second, looking at the schematic, and then she said the thing I'd been too pleased with my own cleverness to say. "That's going to put a lot of water into the wash below the Bonito cluster, the houses along there. There are people in those houses, Hal." She paused. Or there were. And there it was. The cost, laid out plain in one sentence by someone whose mind hadn't been quite so dazzled by the elegance of the trick. If I pulled the infected east toward open water, I pulled them toward whatever living people were still hiding in the houses strung along that wash. I would be buying our road north with their morning. I stood there with my hand on the keyboard, the command staged, the cursor blinking. And I felt the full weight of what the day had already turned me into, a man who could do cold arithmetic with the lives of strangers and feel a flush of relief at how the numbers came out. I almost reversed it. My fingers were on the keys. And then I thought about Wren in Flagstaff, whether she'd drunk from a tap that morning before class, whether she was inside the line or outside it. And I thought about how somewhere a stranger she'd never meet might be making the exact same cold calculation right now that would keep my daughter alive. And I left the valves open. I'll tell you plainly, because I've never lied to you in any of these. I'm not sure that was the right call. I have turned it over 1,000 times since. In the dark, on the road, in the shower with clean water running over me. I traded people I'd never met for people I loved and for my own skin. And I told myself the eastern houses were probably already lost anyway, which might have been entirely true, and might also have been the disinhibitor in my own blood talking. Shaving the edge off my conscience exactly the way Sela had warned me it would, making a monstrous arithmetic feel reasonable. There is no clean version of that minute. I left the valves open and we drove. The drive to the Mesa should have taken 40 minutes on those roads. It took us a little over 3 hours. The roads were a record of the night written in stalled cars, angled across lanes, in drivers' doors hanging open, in a child's backpack lying in the middle of a chapter house parking lot, in things we drove past fast with our eyes forward and didn't speak about. And we learned the rules as we went, the way you learn anything when the price of learning slow is your life. The infected didn't roam in packs, not at first, not in the daylight. They oriented. We'd see them standing in a field or a bare yard or the bed of a parked truck, utterly still, faced toward the nearest sound or the nearest shine of water, like compass needles. And they wouldn't react to our engines until we crossed inside some radius, some trigger distance, and then they'd come all at once, fast and silent and absolutely committed. And they didn't tire, and they didn't slow, and they didn't feel the barbed wire fences they ran straight through, leaving themselves opened up on the wire and not caring. Sela drove the lead truck because she knew every back route on that land, every grade and wash and cattle gate, every place where a dirt track that looked like nothing on the map would carry you around trouble and save your life. I followed close in mine with the VHF and the gear stacked in the bed, watching her brake lights, learning to read the hand signals she threw out her window flat palm for slow, fist for stop, a chopping motion for turn here. Twice we had to stop and back up and find another way because the road ahead was simply blocked by wreckage or by numbers. The second time, in a low spot where someone had left a stock tank open for cattle, a big, round, galvanized tank brimming with water. We found out just how right the radio voice had been about open water, in a way no description had prepared me for. There were dozens of them standing in and around that stock tank, in the water up to their knees and their waists, under the now fully risen sun, not drinking, not doing anything, just standing, all of them faced outward away from the water, like iron filings arranged around a magnet, like worshippers around a well. They turned toward us all together the instant Sela's brakes squealed on the dirt, every head swinging at once. And the sound they made when they came off that tank wasn't a moan or a scream. It was worse than that. Far worse. It was nothing at all. Just the slap of bare and booted feet on dirt and the rush of bodies through dry brush, dozens of them flowing toward us in total silence. And we reversed down that track faster than was safe with both trucks fishtailing in the soft sand. And Tobias hanging out the passenger window of the lead truck firing the deer rifle. Not trying to hit anything, just making a louder, sharper, closer source of sound off to one side to try and split their attention, to give them two things to orient on instead of one. And it half worked. It bought us the seconds we needed. And we got clear with one of them actually reaching the tailgate of my truck and slapping it flat-handed once before it fell away behind us in the dust. After that, nobody talked for a long stretch. The desert went gold, and then white gold as the sun climbed, and the shadows pulled in short and hard under everything. And I kept coming back to that one fact. The agent degrades in sunlight. and I watched the infected we passed at a distance to see if it was true. And it was, a little, enough to matter. By mid-morning, the ones we saw out in the full open sun seemed slower to orient on us. More sluggish, a half-second of delay before their heads came around. As if the longer the agent broke down in their blood, the more the lights came up on whatever was left underneath. And what was left underneath was not better. It was confusion. Some of them, out in the bright open ground, seemed almost to be searching, turning in slow, uncertain circles, lifting their hands a little. And that was somehow the most terrible thing I saw all morning. Worse than the stock tank, worse than the body in the road, because it suggested that somewhere deep in there, a person was still partly home, locked in and couldn't find the door, couldn't find the way back into their own life, and would die out there in the sun, still looking for it. We reached the base of the mesa a little past 10. The service road switchbacked up the south face exactly as I remembered it, cut into the red rock and graded for our trucks the fall before, gated at the bottom with a steel swing gate and a chain I'd run and locked myself in October, grumbling the whole time about installing a heavy-duty padlock on a road to nowhere that no one would ever drive. The chain was still locked. The gate was still shut. Nobody had been up. That padlock, that boring overkill padlock I'd complained about, was the first thing that had gone completely right all day. The first system that had simply done its job. And I could have wept over a chunk of hardened steel. We cut it with the bolt cutters from Sela's truck, drove both vehicles through and closed the gate behind us, looping it shut with Sela's own lock from her toolbox. Then we crawled up the switchbacks in low gear, the engines growling, the whole burning world dropping away below us, turn by turn. And as we climbed, I could see it. Far off to the east, exactly the thing I'd built with my hand on a keyboard. A long silver thread of water shining in the wash below the distant Say Bonito housing cluster, where the eastern network had bled itself out into the low ground as I'd commanded, catching the sun like a blade laid across the land. And dark shapes moving toward it, moving across the desert from every direction, from the north and the south and the far edges, drawn east, drawn away from us, drawn toward the water by my hand on a valve 40 miles back at a station I'd already left. The bait was working. It was working perfectly. I had turned the high desert into a machine for moving monsters, and the machine was running exactly as I'd designed it, doing precisely what I'd asked. And I have never in my life felt less proud of a system performing to spec. The mesa top was everything I'd promised the others, and more. The enclosed tank stood at the center of the flat caprock, a fat, welded steel cylinder 40 feet high, painted the same chalky silver, no overflow, no open surface, sealed against the sky. The caretaker's shed sat beside it, cinder block, squat, with a corrugated steel roof. And inside it, the small diesel generator and the wellhead and the sealed pressure tank and a work table. And the door was steel, and it locked from inside, with a slide bolt and a hasp. From up there, you could see 30 miles in every direction. The whole curve of the land, the highway a thin pale line, the mesa standing blue in the distance, the eastern wash shining with my flood. One road in, and we held the top of it. Sun all day, beating down on the caprock, which meant the agent in our own blood was breaking down hour by hour up there in the light. And the clean, deep well meant we weren't drinking any more of it in, for the first time. Since 6:40 that morning, since the overflowing tower, I let myself breathe all the way down to the bottom of my lungs, and the air up there was thin and dry and clean and tasted like nothing had ever happened. We set up the way practical people set up, the way crews make camp, dividing the work without much discussion because we all knew what needed doing. Tobias and Sela secured the shed, checked the generator's oil and fuel, ran an inventory of everything we had, and wrote it on the back of a work order with a carpenter's pencil: water, food, fuel, ammunition, batteries, fuel for the trucks. I climbed the tank with my antenna components and the coil of wire and a roll of electrical tape and my small toolkit clipped to my belt, up the welded ladder rungs to the dome top. And I built myself a base station up there, at the very highest point, for 30 miles. The antenna mounted as high as I could safely get it. The lead run down to the radio I'd set on the catwalk and wired to a deep cycle battery from one of the trucks. And up there, at that elevation, with a proper antenna instead of the station's roof whip, the VHF came alive in a way it hadn't down below. I could hear the world again, the real scattered world of the living. And the world, it turned out, wasn't as silent as the empty roads had made it seem from inside a truck cab. There were voices on the air, scattered, faint, careful, the voices of people who'd learned in a single night to keep their transmissions short. A trucker holed up in a rest stop south of Gallup, talking low, reporting what he could see from his cab. A family in a basement somewhere counting their bottled water out loud, the father's voice steady for the kids' sake. A nurse at a clinic that had become a fortress, methodical, reading off a careful list of what worked against the infected and what didn't, confirming everything the loop voice had said, that the bite was the vector and the water was the primer. 2 systems and adding one thing the loop hadn't said, one thing she couldn't explain. The children who'd been bitten turned slower than adults, sometimes hours slower. And her voice broke clean in half when she said it. And she had to stop transmitting for a while. I logged it all in a notebook, every voice, every fact, every grid reference anyone gave. And I made contact. I keyed up and I gave them the one piece of intelligence I had, that they didn't stay away from open water. All of you. It draws them. It gathers them. And the Eastern network is being drained right now to pull them off the populated western areas. So get west of the wash, if you possibly can. Get to high dry ground. I became, on top of that tank in the wind and the sun, a thing I had never once been in my entire career, despite everything I'd built. A node that mattered, a voice that could change where the danger went. The Water Authority had spent 8 months and a fat contract paying me to keep a system running smoothly. Now I was running it for the only purpose left that made any sense at all, which was to move the thread around the board like a chess piece, and buy strangers I'd never meet a few more hours of life. And then, late in the afternoon, with the light going long and gold across the caprock and the eastern lure still pulling them away across the land, I caught the transmission that took the whole day apart a second time and rebuilt it into something far worse than a poisoning. It came in clean, strong, professional. Not a survivor, not a scared family in a basement, not a tired nurse. A coordinated voice, the kind that comes from a real station with real power behind it and a script in front of it. The cadence of an operation, not an emergency. It was addressed to all field assets, and it used the cold, flat vocabulary of logistics, not of disaster. It thanked the field assets for primary dispersal completion. It announced that secondary collection would commence at designated convergence points at 2100 hours. And it began to read out grid coordinates, one after another. And I had a regional map spread and weighted down on the catwalk, marked up with my own elevation survey work from the fall. And I plotted them as fast as my suddenly shaking hands could move the pencil. And every single convergence point on their list was an open water source. The biggest tanks, the treatment plant clarifier basins, the largest stock ponds, the reservoirs. And the single largest convergence point on their list, the one the voice called primary collection, was the silver thread shining in the eastern wash. The flood I had made, the water I had released to pull the infected off the living, was on their operational map, the centerpiece of their entire plan. I sat down hard on the cold steel of the catwalk, with the radio in one hand and the pencil falling from the other. And the whole architecture of the day clicked into a new shape. A shape I had refused to let myself see all afternoon, because seeing it meant admitting that my one good, clever decision had been somebody else's plan running through me all along. The water hadn't been poisoned to start a chaos. Chaos was a means, not an end. It had been poisoned to start a herd. The agent made the population reckless and unafraid and easy to bite. The bite made them into things that walked towards water. And someone, somewhere, with grid coordinates and a schedule and a calm professional voice, was using open water across an entire region as bait to gather the infected into collection points, like cattle drawn to water tanks, then funneled into pens. The water didn't need to infect everyone. It just needed to gather them. And the people who designed it had counted on exactly someone like me. Someone who knew the network intimately. Someone who would panic when it all came down. Someone who would get clever and try to use the system to save himself and root the threat away from the living. And in doing so, would drive the infected straight into the very basins they wanted them gathered in. I thought I was the lone engineer turning the system against its makers. I was a feature of the design. I was the intelligent variable they'd built the whole plan to recruit. And I had performed exactly to spec, just like everything else I'd touched that day. I sat there on top of that tank with the sun going down red across 30 miles of high desert, the eastern wash full of the herd I'd helped collect for them, and I understood the true shape of the thing I was inside of. This was not an outbreak. An outbreak is an accident. A thing that escapes, a tragedy with no author. This was a harvest. There was a hand on it. And at 2100 hours, in a little under 4 hours, somebody was coming to collect what they'd grown. I climbed down and I told Sela and Tobias everything. Sitting in the shed as the light died, including the part where my own cleverness had served the people who'd done this, where the flood I'd been so quietly proud of was the jewel of their operation. I owed them that, all of it, the shame included. Sela took it the way she took everything, by going straight past the feeling and into the next problem, her jaw tight. Then they're coming here too, eventually, she said. We're the high ground. We're a clean water source. We're exactly the kind of asset somebody running an operation this size is going to want to control. Not tonight, I said. Tonight they're collecting the herd at the convergence points. We're not on their list. We don't read as a collection site to them. We're enclosed, no open water signature for 2 miles. To them, on whatever map they're working from, this mesa reads as empty rock. And tomorrow? Tobias asked, quiet. After they collect, when they start looking at the rock that isn't empty. I didn't have an answer for tomorrow, but I had one for tonight. And it came from the only thing I'd done all day that I was completely sure of, which was reading a system better than the people who'd built the plan on top of it expected anyone to. They'd built their whole operation on 2 facts: that open water draws the infected, and that the network could be used to herd them. Both true. Both things I'd proven for them with my own hands, but I knew something about that network. They were treating as a fixed constant rather than a variable I could still touch. I knew its pressures and its zones. I knew that the eastern flood, their primary collection site, the centerpiece of their 2100-hour harvest, was being fed and held by a pressure zone whose master valve I had opened by command that very morning. And I knew that I, still, from up here, with the base station rewired and a clear line of sight for 30 miles, might still be able to reach the 1 or 2 field units near that zone that had somehow stayed green all day, that had never lost their link. They herded the infected to the eastern wash using open water, I said, working it out loud, slow, feeling the shape of it as I spoke. If I close the eastern zone, slam the master valve shut, and reverse the drains so the standing water pulls back into the pipes and runs off downhill past the site, then the wash goes dry. The collection site dries up before they're 2100. And the herd they spent this whole day, and a whole poisoned region gathering, loses the thing that's holding it in place. It starts to scatter, looking for the next open water, right at the moment their collection teams arrive expecting a full pen. Sela saw it before I finished, her eyes coming up sharp. You'd scatter their harvest, right in their hands, at the single worst possible moment for them. And the best possible moment for everyone west of that wash, I said. Including those housing clusters I drowned this morning. If the water pulls back instead of rising, anybody still hiding in those houses gets the infected pulled off of them, and then scattered, confused into open country, instead of penned up and controlled and turned into whatever the next phase of this is. It was a way to take back the worst decision I'd made all day. And it was also, plainly, a way to declare war on people with grid coordinates and a script and the demonstrated power to poison the water of an entire nation in a single night, by directly sabotaging their operation from on top of a tank they didn't know was occupied. The second they saw their collection site fail and traced the valve commands back to a live source on the network, they would come looking for that source. And there was only one road up. I want you to tell me honestly what you'd have done in that shed with the light dying. Sit tight on the high ground, stay invisible, survive the night, and worry about the morality of it in the morning. Or reach down into the system one more time and blow up a harvest, knowing it paints a target square on the only safe place you'd found in the worst day of your life. We argued about it for the better part of an hour as the dark came down over the caprock. And the stars came out hard and close, the way they only do that far from any town. And in the end, it was Tobias who settled it, the deacon, the gentle one, the big man who'd nearly died because he couldn't make himself drop a dying boy. He'd been quiet a long time, turning his church-calloused hands over in his lap. And then he said, I held on to Donovan because I couldn't make my hands do the cold thing. And it almost got all 3 of us killed. I'm not doing the cold thing again. He looked up. Except the cold thing tonight isn't reaching down to that valve. The cold thing tonight is staying quiet and safe up here and letting them have that wash and everybody it pulls in. That's the cold thing. I'd rather we do the warm thing and pay for it than be smart and careful and have that on us the rest of however long we get. Sela looked at her brother a long moment in the dark. Then she looked at me, and she nodded once, and that was that. I climbed the tank in the dark. It was the most precise work I've ever done with the worst tools and in the worst conditions I've ever had to do it. Hunched on a steel dome, 40 feet up in a cold wind that wanted to pluck me off and throw me down the south face, working a base station I'd built that afternoon out of scavenged parts and tape. A headlamp clamped between my teeth so I wouldn't put light on the sky. Trying to reach 2 field units 40 miles off in the black that might or might not still be listening. I keyed the command sequence in by hand, raw control strings, the low-level language you fall back to when all the friendly software is gone and you're talking to a machine in its own first tongue. The way I'd learned to do as a young man before the interfaces got nice. The first unit didn't answer. I sent the string again, and it didn't answer. and my heart went straight down, through the steel and the rock, and into the ground. I switched to the second unit, and sent the string and waited counting, the wind pushing at my back. And it answered. It answered. One valve, the Eastern Zone master, sitting green and patient and obedient at the head of the wash. The last loyal piece of a system that had been turned into a tool for harvesting human beings. And it was still mine. I sent the close command and watched the acknowledgement come back, the valve reporting itself shut. Then I reversed every drain in the zone, which would pull the standing floodwater back into the network, and run it down toward the deep low ground far past the collection site, dragging that silver thread away from the pen and off into empty country where nothing waited. And I watched the elevation map I'd marked with their convergence coordinates, knowing that 40 miles off in the dark, a flood was beginning to recede. And I heard that someone had spent an entire day and an entire poison nation to gather was about to find the water going out from under it right as the collectors rolled in. I couldn't see it happen, 40 miles off in the black, but I heard it. The professional voice came back on the air at 2050, 10 minutes before their scheduled collection, and the script was gone out of it. The calm was gone. I heard a man trying hard to keep his voice level while reporting that the primary site was draining anomalously, that the assets were dispersing off-grid, that they had lost convergence at primary. And then I heard him stop and receive an order I will remember for the rest of my life. An order to abort secondary collection and to locate and neutralize the network actor. And I knew. Hunched on cold steel with a headlamp in my teeth and the wind in my collar, exactly who the network actor was. We did not sleep that night. We sat in the cinder block shed with the steel door bolted and the generator off, so we'd throw no light and make no sound that carried. And we took turns watching the one road through a gap in the door. And we listened to the radio in the dark, with the volume turned almost to nothing, our heads bent close to the speaker. Somewhere to the east, a plan that had eaten an entire region had come apart in the last 10 minutes before it paid out. And the infected, that someone had wanted gathered and penned and controlled, were instead scattering confused across 40 miles of high desert under a degrading agent and a hard white moon. Free and leaderless and terrible, yes, but no longer a tool in anybody's hand. We had taken the harvest away from the harvesters. We just hadn't taken away their sudden, focused interest in us. I don't know who they were. I want to be honest about that with you, because the easy ending, the satisfying one, would be to name them, to give you a face and a flag to hate. And I can't. I never learned whether it was a government program that had slipped its leash, or a contractor running a live test on a population they'd been told no one would miss, or something with no name at all that simply had the resources to reprogram a water system and the cold to call the result a harvest. What I know is that the Navajo Nation and the lands and people around it were chosen, I'm certain of it, precisely because they were remote and underserved, and the kind of place where the lights going dark at 1 in the morning wouldn't be noticed by the rest of the country until it was far, far too late. That's the part that has never once let go of me, the part I carry into every pump house I walk into now. Somebody looked at a map and chose people they had decided were expendable, and treated an entire region of living human beings as livestock to be primed and gathered and collected. And the only reason any part of their plan failed is that they'd built it to recruit an engineer's cleverness. And the engineer they got happened to have had his cleverness scared clean out of him by 6:40 that morning and replaced with something harder, slower, and more careful. We held the Mesa for 9 days. I'll give you the shape of those 9 days, because the day of the outbreak is the story, and the 9 days are the cost of it. And the cost is the part that's true. The agent degraded, just as the loop voice had promised. And as it did, the infected out in the open country grew slower and stranger and fewer. They died of the things the living die of when there's no one to mind them: exposure on the cold high nights, injuries that didn't heal. The simple running down of a human body pushed past everything a body can endure until they just stopped. Out there, in the sage, faced toward whatever they'd last been looking for. The clean, deep well kept us watered and, more than that, kept our own minds clearing. And by the third day, I trusted my own judgment again, which was its own particular kind of grief, because trusting it again meant I had to honestly go back and reckon with the things I'd decided on day one with a primed and shaved down mind, and sort the decisions that held up from the ones that didn't, and live with both columns. The eastern houses I'd flooded, the ones Sela had named in the booster station, while I admired my own trick on the 5th day. Then I reached a man on the radio who'd been inside one of them. He told me the water had risen in the wash before dawn, and then, hours later, had drawn back down and run away east. And that in the gap between the rising and the falling, while the infected that the water had pulled in were milling and then scattering, his family had gotten out and gone west across the dry ground to high country. He thanked me for the water pulling back, because the water pulling back was what gave them their gap. He never knew that I was the same man who'd sent the water in to begin with, who'd weighed his family's mourning against a road I needed and chosen the road. I let him thank me, and I didn't correct him. And that is a weight I picked up on purpose and have carried on purpose ever since. Because some debts you don't get to set down, and that one I don't want to. The collectors came on the 7th day. One vehicle, up the one road, slow and careful. Men who moved like they'd done this kind of thing before in other places. I'd had 6 days to prepare the only thing a tank on a mesa lets a man prepare, which is the road. And I'd prepared it the way an engineer prepares anything, by understanding the system better than the people about to use it. I won't lay out the details. It's enough to say that a service road switch backing up a south face has pinch points and grades and a culvert at the second turn. And that I knew the load rating of that culvert because I'd signed off on the calculations the autumn before. And that the people coming up that road in their vehicle were relying, without knowing it, on that culvert holding the way it was built to hold. And it did not hold, because I had spent 6 days quietly making certain that on the one day it mattered, it would do exactly the wrong thing for them at exactly the wrong moment. They did not reach the top. We watched the dust settle far below at the second turn, and we did not go down to look. And the radio traffic about the network actor stopped after that day. I have to assume they decided that whatever was on top of that mesa cost more to take than it was worth to them, or that they had larger failures to clean up across a region that had not, in the end, gone according to their script. On the 9th day, a National Guard convoy came north up Route 491 from the south. Real soldiers, real vehicles, a real chain of command. The first sign in 9 days that the outside world had finally noticed the lights were out across an area the size of a small state. They were the ones who told us it had been contained to the region, that a hard quarantine had been thrown around the whole affected area days before, that the official story being assembled even then, even as they spoke to me, was a contaminated water event and an outbreak of an unidentified waterborne pathogen, with no mention of a 3:18 a.m. login, no mention of convergence points or designated collection, no mention anywhere of a harvest. I told a guard captain everything I've just told you, sitting in a folding chair under a canvas tent at the base of the mesa, with a paper cup of coffee going cold in my hands. And I watched him write some of it down and decide in real time which parts he was allowed to believe. And I understood that the larger system, the real one, the one made of agencies and reports and approved narratives, was already closing over the truth the way the desert closes over a body slowly, patiently, completely, until there's nothing left on the surface but a shape in the sand that you'd only recognize if you already knew exactly what to look for. Wren was safe. Flagstaff was outside the line. She had texted me 40 times across 9 days, and every one of those messages landed on my phone all at once when the convoy's relay came up. And my phone found a network that answered. And I sat in that folding chair under the canvas and read them in order, from the first frightened one to the last numb one. And that was the only time in all 9 days that I cried. Here's the thing I keep coming back to. The thing I'd want you to carry out of this, if you carry anything at all. I spent 26 years believing that if you truly understood how a thing was built, you could predict how it would break and stay one step ahead of it. And the people who did this understood that about me, and about every competent, careful man like me. And they built their entire harvest on the bet that the clever and the capable, faced with collapse, would reach for the systems they trusted and use them in exactly the predictable ways that served the plan. My competence was a variable in their design. The only reason any of it failed is that on the worst morning of my life, I learned, far too late to be proud of it, to stop trusting the system and start using it with both eyes open about what it could do to people, including the people I loved, including me. Sela said it best on about the 6th night, the two of us sitting in the shed door watching the dark and the cold stars. The water didn't turn anybody into a monster, she said. It just made everybody a little more like the worst version of themselves and called it normal. That's the part that should scare you, not the ones out in the wash. The fact that you can be turned and never once feel the dial move. I still do water work. People ask me how I can stand to after all that, and the honest answer is that I can't stand to do anything else, that I'd be more afraid not doing it. Somebody has to understand these systems better than the people who would use them against us. Somebody has to know the load rating of the culvert at the second turn before the day comes that it matters. I read the chlorine logs with a different set of eyes now. I notice when a tower is overflowing on a road where it has no reason to be. And every single morning, before I let myself drink my coffee, I think about a frozen test pattern on a motel television. And a man face down on the center line with one boot off and the wind moving the empty flap of his jacket. And how the whole catastrophe announced itself first as nothing more than water going where it wasn't supposed to go. On an ordinary state highway at 6:40 in the morning, on the edge of a land that somebody, somewhere, with a map and a budget, had quietly decided no one would miss. They were wrong about that. I missed it. I'm still here, and I remember every hour of it. And now so do you. If this story stayed with you, sit with the one question Sela left me with out there in the shed door, whether you'd ever be able to feel your own dial moving before it moved too far. And then tell me what you came up with, because I've been carrying it for a long time, and I still don't have a clean answer. Stay safe out there. Watch your water. And if grounded survival stories like this one are your kind of thing, you already know where to find the rest of them.